Welcome to the Traveling Fool. I'm your host, Bob Bales, and I talk about places that are just off the tourist path, places that most tourists just don't know about because, well, nobody told them about it. And today, we're going to talk about a place in Europe, just outside of a very famous tourist location. I hope you enjoy it. The Czech Republic, or Czechia, as it's also known as, is one of the more popular tourist destinations in Europe. They get about 20 million visitors a year, and the city of Prague gets about 8 million visitors a year. I've been there. It's beautiful. I had the luxury of going a few years ago. Today, if you go, you might just share the city with between 20 to 30,000 other visitors. Makes for a little bit of a crowded experience. You'll still enjoy it. I'm telling you, the city is absolutely gorgeous and there's a lot of stuff to see and do there. But if you want to get off the tourist path just a little bit and avoid 20 or 30,000 other people, then there's a place you can visit that's about an hour away by train, and it's just absolutely fantastic. I'm talking about the city of Pilsen, home of Pilsner beer. They invented it, people. That's the reason I went there. I mean, if you're going to go someplace and you find out that the place that invented Pilsner beer is an hour away, well, you're going to make that pilgrimage. So when I found out that the holy mecca of beer is in a city that's about an hour away from me, I had to figure out how to get there. I was traveling alone, which I do a lot, so I didn't have anybody to rely on or anybody to ask. But since I was in Europe, I knew one thing. Most countries in Europe have fantastic train and bus travel. It's on time. It really isn't all that expensive. It's safe. And it's a great way to get to where you want to go. And the Czech Republic is no exception. I mean, their trains and buses are on time, and they're a great way to get around. So I went down to the train station, grabbed me a ticket, went to Pilsen. Now, I'll tell you a little bit more about how to get there in the end, but I'm going to tell you why you should visit Pilsen, because it is a fantastic city to go see. Now, I already told you, the biggest reason I wanted to go there was they invented Pilsner beer. So anybody who drinks any kind of beer, you tell them, hey, would you like to go visit the place that invented Pilsner beer? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say yes. Now, when you arrive in Pilsen, if you're taking the train, you're going to arrive, step off, walk out the front door, and you're going to see the Pilsner Urquell Brewery. Pilsner Urquell is one of the most famous beers in the Czech Republic. Well, it's famous all over the world for that matter. And that brewery has been around for a long, long time. They founded the brewery in 1842. Nowadays it's owned by a big conglomerate, and they own several different brands, but they are still in the same place they have been since 1842. They do have tours. You can take a tour of the place. They run 2 or 3 times a day. English-speaking tours, that is. And it's a really cool place to visit. They're going to show you all around the place. They're going to show you how they brew the beer, both the new way and the old way. Now, many years ago, when they first started brewing over in Europe, they didn't have refrigeration systems like we do today, so they had to figure out a way to keep things cool. Well, the easiest way to keep things cool is put it underground. So they've got about 6 miles of tunnels underneath the brewery where they used to store the beer until it was ready to be moved out to wherever it was going. Now, when you visit the brewery, you can go down in those tunnels, and they'll show you where they stored it. And in fact, when I was there, I don't know if they still do this or not, but when I was there, they had a guy down there that showed you actually how they brewed it way back in the 1800s, and he'd give you a little bitty taste of what they used to brew. It was really good. When you get finished, you can go up. There's a big museum there, the beer museum, of course, where they have a pub, and you can sit and enjoy a couple of glasses of nice, cool Pilsner Urquell beer. It's well worth the tour. It's well worth the trip. And a lot of people don't know that it's only about an hour outside of Prague. So don't tell no one. We'll just keep this between you and me. That way that we won't have to fight 20,000 people a day. Because I'm telling you, when they find out that there's a Pilsner brewery that invented Pilsner beer an hour outside the city of Prague, that place is going to be jam-packed. But that's not the only reason to visit this really cool town. Now, I told you about the tunnels that are underneath the brewery. Well, when you walk around in the downtown area, you're going to see some signs that'll tell you about tours of the historic underground of the city of Pilsen. There's several of them that do this. I took one tour. It didn't cost but $2 or $3. But there is a tunnel system underneath the entire city. Because way back when, they would use it for city defenses. In case they were attacked, they could always run underground real quick. They could store all kinds of stuff down there. And they could move around from one part of the city to the other underground if they needed to. And it's really cool. You see a lot of neat stuff if you take one of these tours. Well worth it. I would highly recommend doing it. One of the other things that's really cool about this city is just the old buildings. I mean, from the Cathedral of St Bartholomew to the 15th century town hall building. You're going to see a bunch of really old, cool architecture and buildings there. And everywhere you turn, there's just going to be a photo op. So make sure you have a decent camera with you. If your phone takes decent photos, great. You don't want to be lugging around extra stuff if you don't have to. Pilsen also has some really cool museums. I know what you're thinking. I mean, some people love museums, some people don't love museums. I like certain ones. And they've got a couple that I really enjoy. One is the Museum of West Bohemia. Now, the Bohemian Library is known for two things. First is their Art Nouveau library. Yeah, I know, I had to look it up also. And basically it just means Art Nouveau is a style and it's real pretty. And it is. It's a nice looking library. But they've got tons of stuff in there that are like first edition manuscripts and books and paintings and things like this. I mean, it's a really cool place to visit. But the biggest reason I wanted to go there and that I enjoyed it is they have one of the best collections of weapons and arms in the world. I mean, they have military historians coming from all over to visit this place. If you're an enthusiast or you just enjoy that type of stuff, then they've got weapons dating between the 14th and 17th century. I mean, it's a massive collection, and you'd really enjoy it. I did. It's well worth the visit. And I visited Pilsen several years ago without knowing anything about the town other than it was the home of Pilsner beer. That's why I went there. That was the sole reason I went there. But I also wanted to explore the town and see what else they had. That's how I found all this other stuff. I didn't look it up in advance. I just wandered around town and saw this stuff and went in and visited it. One of the things I saw when I'm walking around town, I look up and there happens to be the George S. Patton Museum. So being retired military, big military history buff, and a huge fan of General George Patton, I had to go see what this museum is all about. So I walked up, briefly spoke to a gentleman who was standing at the front, told me it was $1 or $2 admission. So I walked on in there and started looking around. And it was really interesting. It encompassed all about the history of the city during World War II, what happened during the war, and what happened after the war when Pilsen, along with the rest of the Czech Republic, came under the control of the USSR. And during that time, they became one of the USSR's satellite countries. And so they had to follow their doctrines and their rules and their regulations. And this museum talked about that and what was taught in school, how they lived, everything from the everyday life of just the common person that lived there. There was also a couple of short films and videos of things that happened during World War II. There was a lot of displays. There was just all kinds of items there that you don't normally see in museums like this, from cigarettes that the soldiers had in their rations during World War II to school books and books that were taught when they were under the occupation of the USSR and things like that. It was just very, very interesting. I mean, I had never seen so many different items of stuff. So when I walked out, I actually met the same guy that I had talked to briefly before I entered the museum. And I asked him, I said, where did y'all get all this stuff? He said, well, it was mostly mine. I said, what do you mean it's mostly yours? And he told me, I actually forget the guy's name now because it's been several years, but he founded the museum. And he founded it on the principle of George S. Patton liberated this town, not the Russians. Because during the Russian occupation, they were taught in school that the Russians liberated the town from the Nazis at the end of World War II. And he said that's just simply not true. He said George Patton and his Third Army came through here and they liberated our town. And so I wanted to pay homage to the Americans and the person who liberated our city. And then I also wanted to talk about what we had to endure during those years of occupation by the Soviets. So I went back and asked him again. I said, well, what do you mean most of this stuff is yours? He said, well, I've been collecting since I was a kid. He goes, unfortunately, when the Russians came in, or the Soviets at the time came in, he said that a lot of it was confiscated from him. So he did manage to keep some of it, but he had went back and just started collecting again. And almost everything in that museum was something that he personally had collected and found. And it was a massive amount of stuff. And he said at one point he just decided to open up a museum and tell the story. So now every year they commemorate the liberation of the city by having a Liberation Festival. It's held the first weekend in May. It usually runs about 2-3 days. And they have a convoy that comes through town, military vehicles from World War II, and people in period uniforms where they commemorate the liberation of the city by the U.S. military and General George Patton. It's a huge festival. There's all kinds of things going on that weekend. There's music bands playing and orchestras, and well, you're in the Czech Republic and the home of Pilsner beer, so there's a lot of beer flowing during that weekend. And for many years, former U.S. military personnel that actually helped liberate the city would come and be a part of the festival. So I would highly recommend, if you ever go to Pilsen, you've got to go visit the George Patton Museum. And if you want to have a great time, just go the first weekend of May and make sure you take in the festival also. Now, the city of Pilsen has a lot of other great things to see and do. Those are just a couple. If you get there, make sure that you want to go and spend the entire day so you can really thoroughly enjoy the city. And it's not that big of a city, so you can walk around and really immerse yourself and just explore on your own and come up with some really cool stuff to see. You won't have to go very far before you can find a place to sit down and relax for a while and enjoy a nice, cool glass of beer. Now, they do have other breweries in town, and they do have other beers in town. But I mean, come on. You're at the place that invented Pilsner beer, so why drink anything else but what they invented there? They're famous for it all over the world. You can't say, I went to the place that invented Pilsner beer and had a Guinness. That just doesn't work. Trust me, you'll enjoy Pilsner Urquell while you're there. And no, they're not sponsoring this podcast by any means. I'm just telling you, it's really good beer. I enjoyed it 2 or 3 times a day at least while I was there. And if you make the Pilsner Urquell Brewery your last stop before you go back to Prague, it's just right across the street from the train station, so you don't have that far to walk. Unlike what I did, that was the first stop I made when I got there. Well, I also stopped before I left, but that's another story. So how do you get to Pilsen? Well, there's a couple ways. If you rent a car, you can drive. But I don't like to be renting cars when I'm traveling. It's just too much of a hassle, especially in Europe where the transportation is just fantastic and it's easy to use. Pilsen's only about 94 kilometers from Prague, or for us Americans, it's about 60 miles. Doesn't take that long to get there. I went by train. I love traveling by train in Europe, but you can also take a bus. Bus takes about an hour. I'm not sure how much it costs. But the train, they have 2 different trains. They have an express train, which doesn't stop, and then they have one that makes 2 or 3, 4 stops along the way. I was on the one that made several stops, but there's really not that much difference in time. The express train takes a little over an hour, and the one that makes stops takes almost 2 hours. And it's a great little trip. You get to see the countryside. And you get to have a beer or two on the trip, which doesn't hurt at all. Now, the trains run, like I said, I don't know, several times a day. There's probably 4 or 5 of them, and they're not very expensive. Anywhere from $4 to $8, depending on what class you sit in, whether it's first class or second class, and whether or not it's an express train or one that makes stops. And so $4 to $8 one way is not going to break the bank. It's an easy day trip out of Prague. You can catch the early train, come back on the late train, and enjoy the entire day visiting a brand new city away from those 20,000 tourists a day that are crowding onto the Charles Bridge in Prague. Well worth the trip. It'll be something that you can tell everybody about when you get home because, unlike you, all they did was stay in Prague, which is a great city, but there's more to the Czech Republic than just Prague. So thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you get a chance, go check out the blog. It is thetravelingfool.com. And yes, I am the Traveling Fool.